Welcome to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. Today I am joined by Andrew Middleton. Andrew's the founder of I'm Not Done Yet, which is a bold, honest community for over 50s, navigating life beyond the corporate world. After facing ageism and loss of identity in his late 50s, Andrew rebuilt a life full of purpose, connection and curiosity, and he is here to share how. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for inviting me on.
So let's start with this is something I think you said in an interview you did with the Telegraph newspaper. You said you were airlifted out of relevance in your late 50s. I wonder if you could take us back to that time. You know, what was going through your mind, and how did that impact your mental health and your sense of identity?
I mean, just to give you some background on it, in my sort of mid 50s, I kind of realised that my sort of senior business life, if you want to call it that, was probably ebbing. And I kind of knew that if I was going to make a jump to another what I call big job, I would have to do it then. And I did make a jump. It wasn't to a senior job. It was a directorship. It didn't really work, and for a whole bunch of reasons. And by the time I was 57, I knew I needed to get out. And I started trying to work out what I was going to do. And like many people, I went down that very traditional route of coach and consultant. And it's a bit of a tough gig, really, coach and consultant. There's a lot of coaches out there. There's a lot of consultants out there. A lot of them a lot better than me. And it kind of didn't work. And I kind of started experimenting. That's the only way I can describe it. And I think you in your notes across to me earlier, you described it as ending up in a bit of an eclectic job mix. I started realizing that I could do stuff I hadn't done before. I managed to get quite an interesting role as a wedding registrar. And that was putting kind of my corporate, public speaking kind of experience and I guess firefighting and management and doing things on the fly into one place. And that was kind of the start of it. And it was a transition from this sort of corporate world where actually I was hitting my head against a brick wall into something that was very much built around me and what I could do and what I wanted to do. And that's kind of where it's gone. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, yes. I mean, how did you feel though, emotionally, I guess, that, there wasn't going to be another big job for you? Did you feel, you talked about the fact that you were starting to realize you wanted to do something different, but did you feel, after a career, did you feel grief or relief or something in between?
I think that's probably describes it better, something in between. I'm not sure I felt so much that the grief of losing that role. Because I've been quite lucky in that over my working career, I've had a number of roles. I've kind of switched. So I started out as a travel agent, and then I got into IT, and then I got into management consultancy, and then I started managing big non-profits. So I kind of been used to that change. So from that perspective, it was a change. But what the real worry for me actually was kind of maintaining my lifestyle. I think you tend to sort of go along in your 50s thinking, well, this is quite nice. I've got a decent salary and I'm doing this and the children have flown the nest. And then suddenly you're in this position. And I've spoken to a lot of people who are very much the same, that the panic sets in. How on earth am I going to afford my life? Because your pensions tend not to kick in until your 60s. If you're lucky, your early 60s, but if you're looking for your state pension, it's 66, 67. So it's quite a bit of time in between. And that kind of worried me. I concocted the idea of it being the dangerous decade because it was a period where lots of things were changing. It was much harder to play the ground that I played before, that sort of traditional employment ground. I was having to learn how to survive in a new world, self-employment. But most of all, the money wasn't coming in the same chunks. So the lifestyle had to change a little bit.
Let's just talk for a minute before we talk more about, how you've evolved really. But let's talk a bit about ageism in the workplace. Because I think it's the kind of silent kind of very loud issue, which I think a lot of people hit. What are some of the ways you think it's showing up? How can men and women, in their 50s, 60s, manage that?
It's difficult because it's quite insipid, and it comes over a number of areas. I think there is a sort of there's a dichotomy between one world where, companies are inclusive and there's opportunities for older people. And, in that world, everything is supposedly hunky-dory. And then there's kind of the practical real world where you've perhaps got a typical corporate. You might have a senior manager in their 30s or 40s with a team in their 20s and 30s, and they might not really understand how to work with an older person. It's really funny for me. My corporate career kind of ended because I started realizing at 45 I was one of the oldest members in the team, and people did. You get the little jibes, old fella, let's get the old bloke in and see what he thinks. And by the time you're in your 50s, it's becoming quite difficult. I think this could be very controversial, but I hadn't realised how much discrimination women faced through their working career, because, I was a fairly typical, ordinary, shall we say, white middle class man until I hit my 50s. And then I started to understand the insipidness of it, the fact that it is the little comments. It's the fact that you get into your head, you're suitable for that particular project or that role. And then someone else comes in and you can see that they've been promoted in far younger, and, and particularly if you get offered the special project, we're putting you on special projects. That really is, we don't know what to do with you, so we found something we think you might do.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because you've got a career's worth of experience, and, things like technology and even working practices obviously change, and you have there's a currency around that. But you've got that somewhat intangible, 30 years of experience and I guess it can suddenly feel quite depressing to feel that nobody wants that. And, if you were to go for a job in your 50s, I think, you're going to struggle more than perhaps if you were younger.
And I think what really, really annoys me, the nub of the stuff I've been doing with Indie is you have got loads of people with fantastic experience, with fantastic knowledge, and they're just not being used. And the government says, well, we want more productivity, we want people to work in their 60s, but there isn't the opportunities to do that. And that really, really irritates me personally. And I think was a frustration for me that, and even today, I mean, doing sort of my freelance gigs, you still bump into it. You still bump into people who, I've been to meetings where I've sat around with a group of perhaps younger people, and I've almost felt ignored,
Why do you think that is? Why do you think, and I know this is a massive question, but why are corporates ignoring older people, do you think?
Well, I think there's a couple of answers. The first one is, I think a lot of the stereotypes out there, you know, I shouldn't be playing with AI at the moment. I shouldn't be making videos. Um, I shouldn't be doing strategic consultancy for organizations at my age. I should be watching daytime television, probably cruising, probably bowling. I don't, in fact, last night I was watching an advert on television, and I suddenly thought that is kind of why. It was an advert for fashions, and there were all these sort of people in their 20s and 30s, and then they made the point that, and it was for older people as well, it's for everyone. And a lady went past on the screen wearing one of their outfits on a mobility scooter. So it was just highlighting the fact that, older people, they're going to be on mobility scooters. They might have red hair and, a jazzy outfit on, but actually they're still not up to it. And I thought that really did it. But the second reason, I spent a really interesting morning at a job centre recently, talking to people who were in their late 50s and 60s who needed to find work and couldn't. And the really interesting thing they were saying, one particular conversation stood out for me, was this guy who was saying, well, I could do everything they wanted and a bit more. I think the guy who was interviewing me was a little bit intimidated because he didn't have the skills, and the team was a lot younger and they didn't really know how he could integrate me with his team. And I think there's some really practical stuff there that actually there's not a sort of an intergenerational culture. People are confused as to what they do with the old bloke, or when they get him on the team, how can they do it? And it's possible, but it does cause some confusion. A lot of companies just can't cope with it.
So what do you do then? Do you fight this, or do you plan and, take more control and think about perhaps what you wanted to do when you were 8 years old is perhaps something you should have a look at now? I know this idea of, soft retirement, and you talked about completely changing what you do.
Soft retirement was sort of a concept I came up with, because really I talked to a lot of people, and I started to find role models there, people who are doing this being older far better than I could, really, really well. People, and not just people in their 50s or 60s, but people in their 70s and 80s who are really out there having a great time. And I tried to synthesize what it was they were doing. And a lot of it was around, they were doing stuff they enjoyed doing, but they were making money out of it. They kind of changed their skill set. They'd gone from that sort of corporate, I'm a cog, to, I drive the whole thing. And that was kind of a really interesting light bulb moment for me, realizing that, step back, stop trying to do the same old, and try and reinvent myself. A lot of them, going back to soft retirement, had kind of worked out that they didn't want to get to that point at 65, 66, 67 and just stop, for a whole bunch of reasons. And this is where soft retirement came. They kind of stepped back from that big role and created something that worked better for them. For some of them, it was volunteering. For some of them, it was learning. But quite a few of them, it was actually still using their business skills and knowledge to, generate income and do some good stuff. So, the soft retirement sort of came out of those people.
For many men, though, many men have, they spend their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s really focused on their career, maybe family, maybe not, to the detriment of other things. And a lot of their self-worth is associated with, and their identity is associated with the job that they do. So how do you, if that job disappears, or you try and, relaunch yourself, how do you manage that kind of identity, self-worth thing?
the sort of relevancy, not feeling that you have a role is big. And a lot of that is tied around the identity. I think the way I have done it, and I've seen other people do it, is again working out who I am going to be, still having an identity, but almost reinventing yourself as part of soft retirement is kind of that transitioning across and working out who you would be. I mean, I've gone from a pretty staid corporate now to a slightly questionable freelance entrepreneur something. I don't really have the word for it. If I could, I am trying to write a book at the moment all about soft retirement, and I am struggling with what is it I have become, and maybe the answer is I haven't become anything. I'm just me. So I was going to say that I think for a lot of people who go through this period, it's about rediscovering you, and that's what I've certainly rediscovered a lot of my youth that I lost through the corporate machine. A lot of these sort of playfulness and fun that I maybe wasn't in my life when I was in the corporate world.
Give us an example of that. What have you rediscovered from your younger years?
What have I discovered? Well, it's doing things that I would never have done as a corporate. I mean, trying things. I've become mainly because it was something I could do. I've become a fairly accomplished sort of business videographer. I've made over 400 shorts, and I quite enjoy doing it. It's creative, creating the films and videos, working out scripts for it. I perhaps wouldn't have done that. I suppose the other thing I have done is, and this has been a really difficult change for me, going from sort of 8 to 6 or 9 to 5 or whatever, 5 days a week, to actually going to a bit of a life where I don't want to say I work when I want, because I still do quite a bit of work, but the work is not always remunerated. Sometimes I'm a judge for a national competition. I give my time there, but sometimes it is remunerated, and I have to work at certain times. But what I have done is kind of lost that structure. So we're having a discussion today. We're recording this podcast, and I'm going to have the afternoon off. Because I can. Actually, one of the important things that I say an awful lot is because I can. Not because I need to or whatever, because I can. I could have an afternoon off.
It's very interesting, isn't it? This point about, almost decommissioning yourself, about unpicking this idea. There's no law that says you have to go to work at, 8 o'clock on Monday morning and finish at, 6 o'clock on Friday. But over a lifetime, over a career, that's quite hard to unpick, isn't it? And certainly I've had a similar experience to you. I'd say I have a portfolio career now. But even now I feel a bit guilty if I'm not, flat at it, or, from 9 till 5. And that takes a while, doesn't it?
It does. It's probably taken me 6 or 7 years. But equally, I quite like working on Sunday mornings. It suits me. It's quiet. I get quite a bit done. And that idea, enjoying doing it and it being a good time for me, works very well. So it is that reinvention and finding out what matters and finding out what works for you, and then kind of slotting it in.
And I just mentioned this portfolio kind of approach to life, and you were saying that, it doesn't all have to be paid work. Some of it is voluntary, or some of it is just something you enjoy. I mean, you mentioned earlier, you've become a registrar. I think you're a film extra. So you've your living experience or living proof of this.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been a period of experimentation, in terms of what I actually do. I've tried some things. I'm no longer doing film extra work, and I don't do film extra work because actually it's not really viable. You have to be on set at 7 a.m, and you're often there till 6. You don't make a lot of money, and you spend a lot of that on travel expenses. But I enjoyed it while I was doing it. But, some things don't work. The registrar work I've been working through since 2019. It's great work. They buy a certain number of hours. I love doing it. It's just, I'll probably go to 120 weddings this year. And everyone's happy to see you, and it's a happy occasion, but it's a bit of a retainer. They pay me throughout the year, buy these hours, draw them down as they need them. Usually work a little bit harder in the summer, but it's a great job to have.
Do you feel liberated now that you're doing what you want to do?
I do feel liberated. I also feel quite relieved, actually, that I can do it. When I first started out, there was a little bit of a panic. How am I going to cope? Financially, and also with this sort of thinking I needed to be at my desk 9 till 5. I've learned a lot of lessons. I've been very grateful to those people who shared their lessons, the people who've gone before. And I've learned a lot of my own lessons working through to this period. I'm now 66, and I've got to the point where I'm thinking, do I really want to stop? I do have a government pension. I do have a pensioner's bus pass. But actually the fun of doing a lot of what I do, and almost the childlike experimentation. I mean, I've got into AI in a big way. I'm desperately wanting to buy a 360-degree camera at the moment and experiment with that. That's the child in me, I think, coming out, thinking, well, I can do it. How can I find a way to do this stuff? How can I justify it? How can I make a bit of money out of it? So, I don't know, 360-degree cameraman might be my next experimentation. Maybe that's the way I should explain it. This is not looking for jobs. It's sort of experiments that stick.
And presumably this is all very good, mentally and physically going into older age. And, my grandparents' generation sat in armchairs, watching the TV with a tie on from about the age of 60. But if you're, if you're being creative and open and everything else, surely that's going to help you as you get older into your 70s and 80s.
Well, I think this is the big plus, actually. People don't realise. From a health perspective, I'm very active. Mental perspective, I guess like a lot of people in my age group, I forget the occasional things. But it keeps me quite sharp, I think, learning new things. In a way that I don't think I would have if I had a traditional hard retirement, and I do essentially, inside here is an analyst. I look at stuff and I work out what's going on and then decide where I'm taking it and what to do with it. And it seems to me that, the benefits of having certainly at least a foot in the working camp, is really worthwhile.
So just because you've finished your big job or, your corporate career doesn't mean all those skills are suddenly redundant. You just take them off into other areas as well.
You'd be surprised how skills that you've got you may not think are useful. I mean, one of the big skills that people, in their 50s and 60s have got is they've gone through several kind of transitions. We're about to go through, quite a big one on AI. But we've gone through mobile phones. We've gone through technology. When I first started work, I had a typewriter and a phone. And it's surprisingly how resilient we are and what we've learned. For a lot of, younger people, it's first time round on AI. So actually, it's not just about what we know. It's how we can cope with things and that experience. Sorry, I butted into your question.
So I was going to ask, I thought this brings us on to, and I mentioned this at the beginning, I'm Not Done Yet, indie, which is, I think, community you've created. So what have you learned about, the people you're helping through this community?
Do you know that there has been a huge, one single big learning that I never thought would come out of this. And the big learning is it really helps to talk about it. It really helps to share ideas. It really helps to talk things over with people. It's an old saying, chewing the cud, but it really does work, particularly with those people who've been through it. And what I found more than anything is people are a little bit afraid about making that jump, changing, trying something unusual. And to be able to have those conversations and almost to be given permission or to see that it's been successful, that's hugely worthwhile. That's been the biggest indie learning. I've been lots of others. I think, we're all on the same path. We may not realize it. We may have slightly subtle different journeys, but I've certainly noticed some real patterns in terms of how things happen and when they happen. And what you can do about them. That's been sort of another learning. But I guess there are a lot of people out there who do think they're indies. There are a lot of people out there who don't, who want to just retire. But there are people out there who think, why not? People are not alone.
And I think for some people it's very difficult, isn't it? The day after they retire or stop doing the job they were doing. If there's nothing to replace that, then that can quite quickly be, a route to depression. And I interviewed somebody for the podcast who said, whatever your job was, the day after retirement, no one really cares what you did then. It doesn't matter. You're just a normal person. It doesn't matter that you were running a bank, for example. And I guess a lot of people need help to readjust, and it's probably quite a lonely place. So I guess, communities like Indie are there to help those people.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a lot of the conversation that goes on the Indie community is people saying, well, what do I do? And how do I cope with it? And funnily enough, yesterday there was a bit of a thread that started out of someone who had been in academia, who had literally almost just vanished without trace, without any ta-ra or anything from an organization. And it was almost like HR were using a rubber to erase her name from everything. And her colleagues didn't really know what to do, And she sat there the next morning thinking, what now? And I think there's a fair amount that goes on.
Yeah, and also, what did it all mean?
I coached someone through leaving an organization recently. It was quite interesting because it reflected back on me, and I realized that, I've left a lot of organizations and I'm no longer part of that organization. I'm not part of their history. They're current now with, whatever they're doing, but I just don't exist. And I think that's the same for a lot of people who, retire and leave organizations. There is no tangible, real record of us ever being there. So what was it for?
So how do you think society as a whole treats older people?
I think it doesn't really know what to do with us. The government talks about productivity and talks about us like we're economically inactive. We should be doing stuff, but there aren't many opportunities for us. And sometimes, I think, sometimes we're seen as a pool of resource that is available for free. That particularly, we should become charity trustees, which is not a bad thing, but, or drive voluntary cars or things like that. And I had a bit of an experience that sort of brought this home to me in a big way when I was sort of in the early days knocking around looking for work. I had one guy who asked me to help him on some PowerPoint. And I thought, oh, this is like a little Fiverr type job. I can do this. And rather foolishly, I didn't negotiate the terms. And that was, me coming out of corporate life, I think, and not realizing I needed to. And he gave me a little envelope at the end, and it'd been an absolute pain. What I thought had been about an hour just doing a bit of PowerPoint turned out to be about 5 days of change. And could you move this? And could you do that? And can I have that in blue? And at the end of it, he gave me this little envelope, and there was a £25 Greggs voucher in it. And it was just that moment that brought home to me that, whereas I might have had, I don't know, a £500, £600 day rate, I was now worth a £25 Greggs voucher. And he obviously felt that it was quite apt to reward me in that way, So I think they do see us. And rather bizarrely, I had a conversation with an accountant recently, and she said to me, in her 50s, she was worth a lot of money in her role as a senior accountant. When she was made redundant at 60 and she needed a job, the only job she could get was as a bookkeeper for a company. No one else would take her on as an accountant. And she said she came up with this sort of rule of thumb that between your 50s and 60s, you move from being able to, get 100% of your salary expectations to about 30% of your salary expectations. A lot of people have said that, society doesn't value older people. We're seen as a cheap resource.
So I first came across you, Andrew, on some of the articles you've been writing on LinkedIn, actually. And when we spoke before, you said that you were, really surprised by the response you got to your very open posts.
I could not believe, over the last month, I've been viewed 500,000 times. And I thought, well, I'm sitting in a spare bedroom in a small UK market town, having a bit of a rant on LinkedIn about life in general. And it hit a nerve, and I couldn't believe it. And to be quite honest, I still haven't caught up, because I had hundreds of people saying they wanted to connect to me as if I knew what I was talking about. I had lots and lots of messages. I had comments. I thought, well, if these people, I suppose I wasn't expecting the numbers, but if these people are going to leave me a message, I'm going to respond to it. And I have to say, I failed abysmally. I'm only just catching up on that. Still got loads more to do. And it just surprised me. But I suppose what it kind of said is there is a voice, there is a place for a voice about these sort of subjects. And there's not many people talking about it. Well, I have had quite a few comments from people saying there aren't many male voices out there, lots of women. And that's been quite an interesting thing. I guess we as men don't talk so much about these things. And I think there's kind of, I don't know how you would describe it, but there is a retirement voice out there, but it's not so much around, starting a company or, doing something unusual or staying working into your 70s. And that's probably the difference that people latched onto.
It obviously needs people like you, Andrew. It needs especially men to try and give people permission, make it normal, make it acceptable to voice these feelings. And that's the point of this podcast, actually, is to make it, to normalize talking about your mental health or other struggles in life, because you can guarantee you're not the only one, and many other people are, but they just don't have the channel or the voice, or at this point maybe they don't have the confidence to talk. So just let me ask you one more question here then. So for men who they're feeling like maybe they're on the scrap heap or fading into invisibility, what message would you have for them? You know, they can see the writing on the wall, but perhaps they're panicking or just don't know what to do.
Don't handle it alone. It's a big message, because as men, what we tend to do is most of our friends are often our work colleagues. And sometimes when you do leave work, you end up needing to find a whole brand new set of friends if you can, you know, or they might be your wives or your partner's friends. So talk about it. If you've not got friends, come onto something like Indian and talk there and share your concerns, but be open to discuss it and explore. Don't accept the conventional route. There are lots of ways for people to go. And I suppose the third one is look to people who've gone before you, because that to me has been a huge resource. You know, I have conversations with people in their 70s who are running businesses still, people in their 80s even, and I am just inspired, and it gives me kind of the energy to carry on.
So without wanting to add to all of the messages you haven't responded to yet, you're on LinkedIn, aren't you? If people wanted to find you, or if we put a link to how they can access the Indie network as well, they can access through there.
And it's imnotdoneyet.co.uk.
Right. Well, we'll put that link in the notes. Andrew, thank you so much. I think this is it's a topic that we need to talk more about, and, you know, will affect most of us, I think, at some point. And just a great example of how, as you said just now, you know, you don't have to accept the conventional. And, you know, there's probably far more joy and fulfillment in redefining who you are and how what you do with your life. So thank you very much for sharing your experience.
I'm very happy to. And I think podcasts like this are really important, because generally as men, we don't have these discussions, and to have a place to talk about mental health is hugely important. So I'm very glad to be on here for that purpose alone.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Thank you for listening to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. If you want to find out more about Andrew and the I'm Not Done Yet community, helping people aged 50 to 70 to stay relevant and find a purpose, then visit the website imnotdoneyet.co.uk. To help raise the profile of this podcast, it will really help if you could leave a rating or review it. And please do promote it to your own networks, and it helps to expand the reach of these stories. Finally, there's now a book called Men Speak Up, Journeys Through Mental Health, based on the podcast, and it's available on Amazon and through other online retailers.